Joining us on the news at 10 is EA Jonathan. She's the CEO of Cecil Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us on the news at 10.
Thank you.
I mean, on a day like this, World Humanitarian Day, is it safe to assume that many people who are in the business of, giving humanitarian aid perhaps feel frustrated with the seeming inability of warring sides or intermediaries to bring an end to major conflict?
I would say yes, but the nature of the work is such that you keep pushing, day after day. Humanitarian work has gone on almost as long as humanitarian conflicts or human conflicts have happened throughout the world. So that's always been on. The UN started in the 40s after the Second World War, and we've seen constantly just crises evolve, humanitarian crises change, take on a different nature. So those who work in that space, yes, there is what you call fatigue. So it's safe to say, bringing it home to Nigeria, definitely, we have a lot of humanitarian crises. Around the world, for example, you have a displacement crisis, 65 million people displaced across the world. In Nigeria, official figures 1.8, but we know they're much higher. And there's not enough care for people in that space, who work in that space. I'm sure if you ask even the NEMA or the SEMA people across Nigeria, a lot of them do not have access to trauma counseling because they suffer what we call secondary trauma or vicarious trauma from constantly being out in the field. Imagine a bomb attack. The first responders are the health workers, the NEMAs, and they're picking up the broken bodies. Even the police, even the security forces. So definitely there is a sense, I think the problems are getting bigger. And one of the things we always say is the work not finished. It's just there, and it's increasing in number. So it is frustrating, but the nature of the work is such that, you take a deep breath and you just keep going.
If you were to describe Nigeria's humanitarian crisis, how would you put it as?
It's definitely escalating. And I personally think from what I see, from the way it's being managed, from what the government's focus is, it's election season, it's not going to get any better any soon, sadly. There are a lot of displaced people across Nigeria. There's a lot of focus on the northeast, and yes, there's quite a lot on there, but there's also quite a lot of, we saw the Benue report, Zamfara is there, Taraba, Adamawa, Plateau, and then other issues, other humanitarian issues down south as well. Rains are coming, floods. So we're going to see a lot more as time goes on, and of course climate change and its effects. So I would not say that it's improving. In fact, it's getting worse. And we're not managing our resources very well. And we seem, especially the governments and government officials, a lot of them seem focused on the wrong things, and their sense of it's sound bites we hear. We're not seeing that radical action that we need to see on the field.
How much would you say humanitarian workers are involved, especially with the attacks, pretty much like the victims of these attacks?
The numbers are increasing, sadly. And, for me, when we talk about humanitarian workers, there's NGO workers, the civil society organizations. You've got NEMA, that's the national, and then you've got the state agencies as well. And I think some of the ways they're affected are very underreported. Just last week, again, we heard about a NEMA official that was killed. We've heard about UN officials being attacked. Of course, 2011, we had the UN bombing. The UN house in Abuja was bombed. The culprits have never been caught. These are some of the things we see. And it's increasing in intensity. Some are being kidnapped, held for ransom. And this is a growing trend, not just in Nigeria, but around the world. Funny enough, the theme for this year's World Humanitarian Day is not a target, and it's all about protecting civilians and protecting those who work in this space. The government needs to step up to its responsibility.
What do you make of the humanitarian actors, primarily the United Nations and perhaps other influential countries?
I think when it comes to protections for those who work in this space, in every country, the primary responsibility for security lies with the host government. So, for example, in Nigeria, the primary responsibility lies with Nigeria, for those in the UN space and other humanitarian workers, both the local ones, those of us who work on the ground who are Nigerians ourselves, and then those who are coming from outside. So there's a lot of responsibility on the part of the government. The UN has its own security protocols. They have security advisories they send out to their staff, to work on them. I believe they work in conjunction with other agencies to do that. I think so. There's a lot of work that the governments have to do. I personally think, I'm a ex-UN staffer myself, so I speak from experience. I feel that the UN in Nigeria needs to be a lot more, what's the word? They need to be a lot more harder hitting with our governments in calling them to these responsibilities. Because it's not just about UN workers, it's about other NGO workers that are at risk. And we've gone into certain areas, for example, you go into some camps, for example, there's not enough protection, even for the victims themselves. You're going in there as an aid worker. I mean, I was in Agatu in March, for example, and here we are shouting there's an anti-grazing law in that state. People were there, there was not much protection, and there were just cattle all over the field, taking over their rice farms.
How would you say this affects the morale of those who are involved in humanitarian aid?
Absolutely, it affects the morale negatively. And unfortunately, I think in Nigeria, we've become extremely desensitized and almost used to the idea that we have a government that does not necessarily care, in the sense that, or they don't always care. They will send out lots of officers. When there's a big shot coming into the field, you see the police and the soldiers coming to protect them. But the ordinary people and some of the ordinary workers don't always get those protections. That's not always the case in every state. It differs from state to state. If you ask for help, some of them come, some of them give you police escorts. In some cases, you have to make certain arrangements to have that. But it definitely affects the morale. But one of the things that humanitarian workers have learned to do, the UN has the resources in some ways to provide certain arrangements. For the smaller NGOs who work on the ground, like ours, we sometimes have to just work with intelligence reports, work with the communities to get what the news is about security situation, and just make wise decisions to do that. But there's definitely a need for more investment in those areas.
All right, I'd like to thank you so much, EA Jonathan, CEO, Senso Foundation, for coming on the program.
Thank you very much.